Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Julia Joja. I'm with the Middle East Institute, Georgetown, and George Washington Universities, and I'm joined as always by Dalibor Rohaj, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today in our guest segment, in our second segment, we'll be joined by Nick Lloyd, who's Professor of Modern Warfare at King's College London, and we have a segment for you that is going in depth into Russian and Ukrainian warfare, creating parallels to the old Eastern Front and looking also onto what we should be expecting on the battlefield in the coming weeks. On our podcast, we discuss security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. But before we go into the discussion with our guest, we first have our news segment, the news from the Eastern Front. Very brief note on or catch up on Georgia, and then we are going to do our bit of a deep dive into the outcome of the U.S. election and what that means for Ukraine and the wider region. Dalibor, why don't you start us off with the news from Georgia?
Well, so it's not news per se, but I think one significant sort of factoid about the election that took place some weeks ago is that it was effectively stolen by the Georgian Dream Party, and I think there's now increasing amount of evidence pointing in the direction that the actual result of the election was much closer to the exit polls as reported by Edison and by Harris X, the two pollsters that were conducting exit polls in the country. There's a report done by Professor Hans Gutbrod, who's a German researcher at the Ilia State University in Tbilisi, that sort of goes through some of the number crunching and some of the mathematics, and the paper is being now distributed by one of Georgia's civil society organizations, making that sort of argument that we already sort of suspected was probably true. We were not quite sure how big the margin of fraud and sort of coercion-induced support for Georgian Dream was, but it is pretty clear that this was not a free and fair election, and I'm just worried that this is being completely sort of lost in all the noise around the US election and its implications for Europe. Meanwhile, there's still, an administration in place in the United States that should be dealing with this. There are European governments, European External Action Service, High Representative for Security and Foreign Policy, and it's just, this is just not anywhere near the top of the list of the priorities, and I think that's going to have ramifications that we'll regret later on.
Definitely, and I think for Europe too, we've just had the hearings, we're in the middle, we should say that, of the hearings within the European Commission for the new round of commissioners, and we've recently had the hearing for the future commissioner for enlargement and integration from Slovenia, and in the hearing she has not even mentioned Georgia. She was asked about Georgia and she sort of brushed off a little bit the election results, did focus on the foreign agent law and the anti-LGBT law, but chose not to make it a big topic of her hearing on integration, which also tells us how big the problem is. And instead, she chose to talk about Armenia and Azerbaijan.
And also, so there was an informal meeting of foreign ministers in Budapest where they reportedly didn't have the time to talk about this. Well, there are people who do have the time to talk about Georgia, and those people are sort of making headway in Georgia. And it's not the Western world; it's Russia and China, and so not a thrilling prospect. You can say maybe it's not such a big deal, but it's part of this broader pattern of a sort of Western retreat from the Eastern Front. And I think we have to wonder whether the trend will be reversed or whether it's going to be accelerated when the new administration in Washington takes place. Takes over in January. We can, Julia, if you want, talk about some of the names that are being floated for various cabinet positions and national security advisor and UN ambassador jobs. But perhaps the most salient topic for our listeners is this question of what this election means for Ukraine and for the prospect of ending the war in a sustainable fashion.
Yeah, I think on the name speculated, all of our listeners, just like us, are looking at the names, and some at this moment of recording have been pronounced. Some are still speculated, so still in the cards. And even then, there's going to be plenty of room after there have been the final names for DoD, for state, what that actually means for Ukraine. But what we do know, and Dalibor, I turn to you in a minute, but if I can try to expose this to the extent that we know, and please feel free to add, is that we have a bunch of speculation based on some limited remarks from Donald Trump himself, as well as over the last few weeks from people close to him, including Robert Kennedy, including Elon Musk, including Donald Trump Jr., including, I think that would be the ultimate list of people that have opinionated on what this should look like. And in my reading, what is speculated, right? We've seen the news in the Wall Street Journal a few days ago. What is speculated is that the United States will want, under the Trump administration, will want to obtain a ceasefire that will include maybe extra guarantees in terms of a demilitarized zone so that the ceasefire can be imposed in a sustainable manner. And in general, it seems that everything that Russia holds, Russia keeps for now. And then, of course, one of the aims is to get the NATO prospect for Ukraine off the table temporarily, but also for a very long time from what it looks like. And we've talked on this podcast many times about what this would mean for Ukraine. But my general takeaway is that this is a temporary thing. This is a temporary thing that where we should have learned lessons. We had ceasefires before, Minsk 1 and Minsk 2. The costs of these ceasefires that were then kind of led by the Europeans instead of the Americans have been multifold for Europe itself, but also for the United States. And to me, and then I'll turn to you, Dalibor, to me, the biggest, beyond the tragic outcome that possibly lies ahead of us, the biggest issue will be how fast will we let Russia rearm? So then how fast and how ample will be the cost, medium to long term, for European security overall, whether Russia then decides during the Trump term at the first opportunity or after the Trump term at the first opportunity to reattack either Ukraine or another country, NATO or non-NATO, or both, or something in between. But given the pattern that we have, and given that on the morning after the elections, via Dmitry Medvedev, we had a reiteration of Russia's maximalist goals that they've formulated prior to the full-scale invasion, effectively the United States withdrawal from Europe, effectively the withdrawal of NATO enlargement after 1997, that all doesn't look in any way promising either for Ukraine or for European security overall. Dalibor, over to you.
So there have been a couple of different ideas sort of floated around concerning the possible deal over Ukraine. One of those ideas floated by the former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was that Trump's sort of negotiating tactic would involve basically taking off any restrictions on Ukraine's use of Western weaponry, also providing Ukraine with $500 billion worth of US military assistance going forward to help Ukraine build up its defense forces and deter the future Russian invasion. So that's manifestly not happening, and I think the sort of decision about Pompeo's lack of political future in the next Trump team, I think, indicates that that's not the path that is going to be taken. Look, I think a peace can be sustainable if you make really sort of heroic assumptions about the behavior of Europeans going forward. So you could imagine, even in the absence of US kind of presence on the ground or kind of US kind of underwriting the deal through an explicit security guarantee, like if Europeans were to send a massive military force to Ukraine to police the line of contact, that could be enough of a deterrent for Russians not to try this again. It could also reassure Ukrainians that there is a European future for them. That, however, is risky for the Europeans to do, because if they face Russia in a conventional war in Ukraine, they are no longer protected by Article 5 guarantee of NATO. So it's really sort of them being there on their own. So I don't quite see that happening. To me, look, I think that the deal might stick for as long as Trump is around, in the sense that Trump and Putin will probably make some kind of gangster-like agreement, and they'll try to honor it because they'll be sort of afraid of each other. That's fine as long as it goes. But I think we have to also sort of think about the sort of political ramifications of this within Ukraine itself. I mean, the goal of the game is not simply Ukraine that no longer has to defend itself against Russian military aggression, but if the goal is a Ukraine that can actually join the community of sort of Western liberal democracies and be the next Poland, so to speak, and a success story, I think the odds of that success story are further off than ever before. Because what will happen if this war is sort of brought to an end on kind of humiliating terms for the Ukrainians, while taking away from Ukraine the prospect of NATO membership, which I think is just that's inevitable. I think that's where sort of things are headed. I think what it does to Ukrainian body politic is that once Zelensky is out, Ukrainians are sort of humiliated and embittered about the West. They will feel betrayed by the West, and you will have some sort of backlash against the West. And I think people, the more they realize that EU membership is far away too, that the sort of like hoops they'll have to jump over to get into the EU are just not sort of realistic benchmarks in the situation in which they won't control a third of the country, and they'll be kind of cut off much of the sort of military assistance that they have. I think the sort of prospect for sort of then Russia's destabilizing of Ukrainian politics and bribing of politicians, co-opting political elites is just so vast that it's just very hard for me to imagine like Ukraine sort of staying on track towards EU membership. Even if Russia does actually sort of upholds its end of the deal and does not attack for the next 4 years or something like that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. The prospects for Ukrainian integration into the, like you called it, Western community at large are slimming down. And with that perspective, also the steadfastness of Ukraine's pro-Western orientation that has been the name of the game in the end for the last decade, right? This has been what has been at stake in 2013 with the Maidan, 2014 with the beginning of the war, and of course 2022. So I entirely agree with you. One more thing to lay out there, we've mentioned it in bits and pieces over the past year or so, but I think it's important is then the question, what about Europe? How can we evaluate European readiness or reorientation or adaptation in the end to the coming Trump 2 administration? And here, my problem is the money. Maybe I've spent too much time in the United States, and I guess that's the perspective or the name of the game, but we've had a military budget of the European Union that was symbolic, less than 10 billion, was further cut with the pandemic, despite appeals prior to the full-scale invasion from the members of the European Parliament, has not been increased. And so now we're almost 3 years into the full-scale invasion, and the EU defense budget for research and development and shared acquisition and development is still less than 10 billion, when I think the new Secretary General Mark Rutte said last week that the aid that NATO has given to Ukraine this year is 40 billion, to remind us of the proportion. So the question is, will the Europeans, because the further Asia pivot is inevitable, and the United States on the Ukraine issue and beyond has said as much as you have to take on more responsibility, no matter what the tone is, more aggressive, less aggressive. So for the Europeans to be able to match the levels of Russian production and enable future deterrence independent of Ukraine, it means coming now up with hundreds of billions to be able to match that for the coming year, like coming now up with hundreds of billions. We know that the Europeans have the money. They have a budget of over $1 trillion, but the question is, will they find the political motivation to find this money and make this huge investment into their defense? And I am a serious skeptic at this point. I don't know, Dalibor, if you want to add to this or want to contradict.
No. I think that's a good observation. So, like we might be sad about the election outcome, we can be happy about the election outcome, and Europeans can sort of pick their sides in sort of US political battles as they please. But one thing that I think is obvious, that like this was not an unpredictable sort of shock for anybody. Like this, we have seen this coming for a very long time throughout these past 4 years. I mean, like the possibility of Trump's return to Oval Office, him sort of pulling the plug on either US involvement in Europe or helping Ukraine was a sort of perfectly foreseeable outcome. It's just Europeans decided not to think about it.
And then we had the war, and we could have opted to say in Europe, still with the war, Biden is not going to help us out maximum, right?
So I was in Brussels and in London last weekend in the immediate aftermath of the election result. More often than not, I've encountered a degree of kind of complacency. Like we sort of survived the first Trump term. How is this going to be different? We should be okay. There wasn't a sort of immediate push to do things differently. I mean, yes, there was the Germans and the French were talking, and Sir Keir Starmer in Paris on Monday. So there's something going on, but I don't think people are sort of approaching this with the degree of urgency that they deserve. One idea that I think could help is just looking at the current multi-annual financial framework, in which you have hundreds of billions, maybe 300 billion of euros in structural funds that have not been spent yet, that could be used differently if member states agree. Could be used to build up European defense industry, could be used to help Ukraine, could be used for something else than like repairing roads and bridges and building sort of infrastructure for decarbonizing the European economy or what have you. It just, I don't see the member states kind of being able to forego that money that already is kind of like promised to interest groups and builders and so on. So I think something like much worse must happen for that sort of change of mentality to be forced on Europeans. And in fact, my expectation is that even if Trump sort of comes in and does things that Europeans won't particularly like, that it's going to be different from the first Trump term, in the sense that you do have lots of sort of like Trump curious and Trump adjacent political forces in Europe that might have behaved reasonably responsibly up till now, but might choose a different path in the second Trump term. So I'm thinking about people like Meloni, how staunch a defender of Ukraine will she be under the second Trump administration? And I don't have an answer to that. I just have a hunch that it might not be as resolute as it has been up to date.
Yeah, she's the natural interlocutor, but she still has to get Italy's defense budget above 1.4%. So there's that.
Which she's displaying zero kind of ability or willingness to do. So I think we are in for a difficult period of time on the Eastern Front, and I'm sure it's dawning on many people in Europe. But those numbers have to go up before real action is taken.
Yes, I think as we speak, the lawyers of the European Union are looking into whether the treaties permit us to use the common budget to be able to invest into defense. And I'm positive that with the pressure of Donald Trump returning to the White House, we will see some money to be scrambled. But I think another 10 or 20 billion will not make a difference. I think the question is indeed if we can find hundreds of billions for a population of 550 or so million people. And that, I think, is, like you said, something much worse has to happen for that. But we'll leave it at that and keep you in the loop. And we're moving on to our second segment.
Special guest is Nick Lloyd, Professor of Modern Warfare at King's College London and author of The Eastern Front. So we are having a bit of a sort of singularity here with the author of The Eastern Front appearing on the Eastern Front. We obviously will want to discuss the developments in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine as well, but let us start with your book and its central message. And I suppose the key question I'd like to ask you is why is it that in the imagination of historians, certainly most historians, the experience of the Great War is seen almost uniquely through the prism of the Western Front, through the prism of Verdun and Belgium and the sort of trenches of France. And why is it that the Eastern campaign comes as an afterthought, despite the much heavier human toll? and actually quite dramatic developments and backs and forths that occurred in those years?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's certainly one that I thought about quite a bit when I was writing the book, or at least starting to write it, because my understanding of the First World War had been really dominated and defined and shaped by the trenches of the Western Front. And I think, like certainly a lot of Brits, our war is the trenches, and when we think about trenches, we think about essentially the First World War, and that is of course the Western Front. Not that there weren't trenches in the East, but the East has been quite a sort of a different picture really, and so it was called the Unknown War. That was Churchill's phrase when he was writing in the interwar period, and there was a sense, I think, that the fighting in the East had kind of never been particularly that well known, and had become even more indistinct and confused over the years. And so when we talk about the Eastern Front today, we're usually referring to the Second World War and Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And so there are a number of reasons, I think, why the Eastern Front has remained much less written about than the West. Now, the West is the decisive theatre of war in the First World War. That's where the war is won and lost ultimately. But the Eastern Front has so many implications of what happens, and whereas in the West you get that very clear delineation of the end of the war on 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918, when the guns fall silent. You don't get that in the East. The East sort of changes and mutates into different kinds of wars, and the peacemakers at Versailles in 1919 will be desperately trying to deal with all the myriad problems that the collapse of the empires in the East present. The collapse of Russia, the collapse of Austria-Hungary, the collapse of Germany, all these new nations coming up. And so the Eastern Front is in many ways at the heart of the First World War. And I think if you don't understand the Eastern Front, then ultimately you're never going to understand not only why the war was fought, but the real sort of sinews and core spring of that war.
Let's get to these parallels between the sort of current situation in Eastern Europe and the Great War in a second. But I wonder if you could, for the sake of our American audience, who might not have been sort of exposed really to a detailed history of the developments on the Eastern Front, if you have a sort of 1 minute or 2 minute elevator pitch kind of summary of what happened, who the belligerents were, how the front moved, and what the sort of conclusion of it was, and when was it that things really sort of settled into place in a more or less peaceful way?
Yes, can you please summarize your book in up to 2 minutes?
Well, I mean, we have the outbreak of war between the Austro-Hungarian Empire. We have obviously the Tsarist Russia Empire that is of course allied with France. And we have the German Empire. Germany sends about 2/3 of its army to the west. I mean, more in 1914, but over the course of the war, about 1/3 of its army is in the east. So it's a war that obviously starts in the Balkans with the campaign against Serbia. And then, of course, you have the main Eastern Front, which is the war, the conflict between the Tsar and Austria. And you have a series of huge maneuver battles in 1914, and we have a series of kind of cut and thrust trench warfare type battles in 1915 and 1916. Horrendous losses. Austria needs massive support from Germany to keep going, really. And the war continues to widen, so Romania comes in, Italy comes in, the Allies land at Salonika. And so the war continues to grow until really 1917, of course, when the Russian Revolution takes place, which really transforms the Eastern Front again. And so it's a horrific period of fighting that is overshadowed. And then, of course, the war doesn't really end in 1917. It continues into 1918. And even when you have the peace treaty in Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918, when the Bolsheviks, they kind of take over and then they sue for peace. The Germans and the Austrians are still having to kind of keep troops in the east to keep the place controlled. And so it starts off terribly, it continues in a very, very bad way, and then it gets worse.
That's a good summary. So let's try to build some parallels to what we're having today, to our what we call Eastern Front today. And I want to talk about the military side too, but maybe first the political side. And you draw a very interesting parallel in a piece that you've written a few months ago in Engelsberg Ideas politically between the narrative, I guess, that Putin gives vis-a-vis Ukraine in 2021, 2022, and sort of in preparation of the full-scale invasion, and how he also, in this context and in others, obsessively talks about World War I and the losses that Russia has incurred. And to me, the most obvious one is, and I'd like to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this, where the parallels are, and perhaps whether you see any differences in what Putin argues is basically what he's trying to do is to deny Ukrainian national identity, right? He says in World War I, we had for a moment the affirmation of Ukrainian national identity. They were permitted to participate in the negotiations in 1918, but then, of course, a few months later, Moscow invaded. So we had this brief moment of Ukrainian national identity affirmation, and he essentially says that was not because Ukraine had a national identity, but because the foreign powers, the Western powers, have enabled this. And it seems to me it's almost identical to what he's arguing now. So what do you make of that?
Yeah, and I think, history is clearly of great importance to Putin in terms of how he shapes his entire worldview. History is a really important element of that, and essentially trying to right the wrongs, as he sees it, of history. And in some ways, he's a traditional Russian nationalist trying to fight against the verdict of Brest-Litovsk and the verdict of a kind of Russia that's the sort of western part of the empire has collapsed. It's been ripped away from it in the war, and trying to regain that. And of course, the complaint that Ukraine is merely a product of Western, of the West. It's sort of a creation of the German general staff, of course, is a very convenient idea. Of course, it's not true, but it's one that clearly Ukraine, asks for support from the Central Powers. And if you were in their position, you would do that as well, because in 1917, 1918, they are going to control the region. They are extremely powerful. Their armies are in the field. And so you have to have some kind of sponsor to protect you, to give you kind of life in a way. But that doesn't mean that the nation isn't there or isn't a kind of viable being. It's you need protectors in an environment of chaos and destruction. And of course, what happens immediately is the Bolsheviks, roll in and try and snuff it out. And so I think the parallels are there. I mean, the parallels of what Russia did in Ukraine recently and what it did in 1914 when it rolled through, parts of Austria-Hungary and Galicia. It's very, very similar. They change all the road signs to make sure the children are speaking Russian in schools. So this kind of Russification happens repeatedly in the First World War, and you can see very similar actions in recent times. And so it's a sort of standard part of Russian imperialism that hasn't really changed.
It's fascinating because on the one hand, you almost automatically assume that the Russians are sort of filtering the war through the prism of the Second World War, the sort of talk of denazification and the assumption that Ukraine is somehow part of the motherland that needs to be defended against the West. Yet this sort of trauma of essentially defeat in 1918 and basically surrendering Poland that had been occupied by Russia for over a century and other territories, that must sort of play a big part of the Russian imagination as well. So if I may ask you a sort of more sort of technical military question. So one of the points, I mean, I have to confess, I haven't read the book, but I read Margaret Macmillan's review in the Financial Times, and there she picks up on one striking aspect of the Great War, which was basically that people's assumptions about warfare were upended by technological developments during this era. So you still see cavalry charges and the sort of efforts at moving ahead at great human cost in face of artillery and modern trench warfare. In the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, I think we've seen many of our assumptions about mechanized maneuver upended as well by the presence of drones and kind of the transparency of the battlefield, and it looks like this will sort of have consequences for how wars will be conducted in the future. Do you see the current ongoing war in Ukraine as being potentially as transformative as the Great War has been in the East for future conflicts, or am I going too far?
I mean, I think there's a number of schools of thought on this one. I think the Great War is transformative in many ways, and obviously you have the impact of air power, you have the impact of our use of artillery in depth, so the creation of like a 3D battlefield becomes really important in the First World War, and the sequencing of operations. Now, clearly, the Ukraine war is transformative in its own sense, and obviously probably the most sort of talked about aspect of that has been the use of unmanned systems and what we would call drones. Although they're obviously not autonomous in the full sense, clearly the use of thousands and hundreds of thousands of these kind of systems is quite new. We've never seen this before. Now, they don't necessarily, they're doing all different things. I mean, they're doing the things that an Air Force would normally do. So it's not that they're doing different things, it's just they're doing it in slightly different ways. But in many ways, actually, the Ukrainian war has, I think, just kind of reasserted the dominance of what we might call like traditional ideas about warfare, mass, artillery, things like shell shortages we've got, which, you would only talk about really in a First World War context. So the importance of mass, I think, has really been the main thing. And of course, we've seen, trench warfare, and some of the images coming out of Ukraine are, you put them in a black and white filter, and that looks like straight out of the First World War period. So nobody was really predicting this, and so I think it has really underscored the importance of many traditional ideas in sort of total wars that we have been told have been sort of condemned, or that's condemned to the past really. And so although Ukraine offers many new ideas about warfare, and obviously drones in particular, in many cases it underscores, I think, a series of sort of more traditional ideas about the dangers of exquisite technology and the need for mass.
It's really interesting listening to you, because I'm already thinking how much our political, I guess, errors in calculation have also led to military errors in calculation, or in prediction, rather. In Europe, particularly on the continent, we had this very strong idea that war cannot return to the continent because now we have the European Union, etc., and that the relationship with Russia will eventually lead through cooperation to peace. And of course, how wrong we were politically. But you're telling us essentially that also when it comes to military, operational level, strategic level too, things are actually not that, or haven't changed that much. I also want to ask you from the military perspective about Russian warfare per se, and I guess how you assess their rate of success, if you'd like. It feels to me that with the war, the full-scale invasion in 2022, we've gone through these phases of initially we have mainstream, I guess, media and analysts have been overestimating Russia, right? We thought Russia cannot be defeated. And then we saw there in the first few months with the battle around Kyiv, we saw how big the problems were logistically, operationally, not only. We actually saw that before in 2008 in Georgia, but that's a different conversation. Then we thought Russia would be defeated, and 3 months into the war, we were talking about how this is turning into a long war, which I thought was kind of funny too, after 3 months. And now it seems that almost 3 years in, the military aid that we've delivered to Ukraine has not enabled Ukraine to defeat Russia, quite on the contrary. You're arguing that before the Russian Revolution, already on the Eastern Front in World War I, the Russians were significantly suffering because of shortcomings in their warfare, that they didn't have a coherent strategy for fighting a modern total war, lacked vital equipment, had low morale, poor leadership. And so what are the parallels here? If you're looking back at World War I, Russian performance, military performance before the revolution, and you're comparing it now to almost 3 years into the full-scale invasion, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of similarities, really. I mean, the Russian army in the First World War is composed of peasant conscripts, very thin layer of officers, so morale tends to be quite flat. Training is often quite poor. Hundreds of thousands of troops can't be sent to the front because there's no rifles. This is 1914, so this is within months of the war opening. They have some artillery, and there is a sort of there's an earthy stubbornness to the Russian troops. They're physically tough. They can take a beating. They can take very difficult conditions. And I think obviously there's parallels today with the inflexibility the Russians have shown and the lack of ability to conduct modern combined operations, sophisticated operations. We've all seen those images of tanks just driving straight along roads and getting, hitting mines or getting attacked from multiple directions. So a lot of the kind of poor morale, lack of sophistication, and a really distrust of people taking the initiative is a hallmark of Russian forces. It was then, it was throughout the Soviet Union, and it is now. And I think you can compare that to the Ukrainians, which are much more eager and willing to let people take the initiative and do different types of things, whereas that is distrusted within the Russian system. Now, this doesn't mean that they can't win wars or can't be effective, but of course it relies on mass and it relies on keeping the game going for as long as possible. Now, the problem in the First World War is that they kept it going for 3 years, and then, the morale problems became so great that produced that collapse. Now, are we going to see a parallel here? At some point, is Russia, the system, going to collapse? Can it sustain what it's doing? And that's the great question that we don't know. So we're sort of expecting some kind of internal political revolt or some kind of thing. But of course, like the Russian Revolution, it's going to happen. You just don't know when.
This is, before we let you go, I'd love to sort of spend a few more minutes on this point, because it's so fascinating. So in a way, it's not entirely unfair to argue that the Eastern Front in the First World War did not provide kind of a military type of solution. That, yes, it moved back and forth, but nobody was sort of like decisively victorious or decisively sort of defeated on the battlefield. What happened rather was that there was this dramatic political transformation that was sort of catalyzed by the conflict, where you didn't really have any of the sort of regimes that started the war in place by the end the war was over. Is that your expectation for Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine as well? And that can actually cut both ways. I mean, like, people do worry, maybe not in a thoroughly unjustified way, about the stability of NATO and the EU going forward. And we know that Russia can, destabilize governments and regimes in its vicinity. We shouldn't be taking it for granted that Ukraine is a democracy and that it will be a democracy 20 years from now. So please speculate wildly before we let you go.
I mean, I think in the First World War, there is the Central Powers do win in, really they kick Russia out of Poland and what will become the Baltic states in 1915. And the Russians, they're able to be successful against the Austrians, but they can never really tangle that much with the Germans. And so by 1917, there isn't necessarily a victory on the battlefield, but it's to the point where the Russians really can't win. And then, of course, that political transformation then behind the front then, impacts on the ability of the army to stay in the field. And by 1917, the army is just disintegrating rapidly. So there is a decisive result in 1718. The Central Powers do win. It's just they cannot sustain it. They ultimately lose it in the West. So I think we shouldn't rule out battlefield success, decisive battlefield results. But of course, it is always going to be interlinked intimately with the political situation, because so much of the war is about Putin's own legitimacy and his sort of entire world order and the way he thinks. So it's intimately linked to that. So he can't really back off in that sense. Whereas for Ukraine, it obviously it's linked to the regime in Kiev. But if that regime is changed, I think the desire of the people is still going to be to remain independent, because they don't really want to be engulfed and subsumed within the Russian Empire. They know what the fate of people will be in that state. So that's an existential crisis, whereas it's much more personal to Putin in that sense. That's why it's very difficult for him to untangle himself from the war, because it's his war. And so I think, without rambling too much, I think there is a possibility of decisive battlefield victory either way, probably more so in the sense of Ukraine. I still think Ukraine will win. And I'd be interested to see how long Russia can really sustain this, because it will have an internal effect sooner or later.
Nick Lloyd, thank you for this conversation and for drawing some of these parallels. It was absolutely fascinating.
Thank you so much.
For the third segment, we are skipping on recommendations because we've gone on far too long and it would be inappropriate with everything happening at the same time here on one side of the Atlantic as well as the other. So with that, we'll wrap up this episode. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast on the security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. You can find more episodes and additional content on our website, aei.org, where you can also subscribe to receive our newsletter. We're also on Twitter or X, LinkedIn, and other social media platforms. Please don't be strangers and send us your tips for future guests or topics you'd like us to discuss. If you enjoy this podcast, please consider subscribing, reviewing, and rating us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get them. Thank you, and until next time, goodbye.